Well, my name is Joe Engemann, but in lacrosse circles and hockey circles, I'm known as Jojie. So you call me Jojie Engemann. I was born in Niagara Falls, but my parents moved just after I was born to Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Where did Jojie come from?
Well, I remember back when I was about 3 years old, my father called me Joey because my dad's name was Joe. So they called me Joey. Well, I was 2 or 3 and I used to say Jojie instead of Joey. So my mom said, hey, that sounds pretty unique. Let's go with that. So when I got into lacrosse, she registered me as Jojie Engemann, and it stuck all the way through. And I play Masters lacrosse, now I play junior. All the people I've played with still call me, or people that know me still call me Jojie in lacrosse circles. So it's a nom de plume I like.
I've never seen that name before.
No, it doesn't exist anywhere
which
else.
is great. That's a handle, as they say.
Absolutely, Jim. Yeah. So I lived until I got married in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And why Niagara-on-the-Lake, I'm not sure, but they bought a house there, built a house there. And that became the Spartan house. I'll tell about that in a little bit. But there was really no sports to speak of in Niagara-on-the-Lake at the time. And when I was 4 or 5, my parents wanted to get me into some sport, a winter sport and a summer sport, and I was a bit hyperactive. They wanted to get that energy, excess energy out of me, so they put me into hockey, and I played in St. Catharines, and lacrosse. And I think I was 5 years old, and I'm out for the first time with a lacrosse stick in my hand. And I played with the St. Catharines Minor Lacrosse Association, and then they only had novice. So here I am, I was like 6 or so, I think, at the time, playing in novice lacrosse. But immediately loved the game. And of course, in those days, we all had our sticks outside. You know, the neighborhood kids and the kids I played with would come down and visit, and we'd be out playing lacrosse. So it was a game that I loved right from the beginning.
Just going back a little bit before that, your dad was from the U.S., right?
Yes.
And where did he live in the U.S. before moving up here?
So it's an interesting story. My dad was born in Oregon in 1908.
Wow.
And I'm not sure, but they were farmers. And so they moved to Kansas to do some farming, and he grew up in Kansas. In his late teens, it was decided that he would become a priest.
Really?
So he joined the Carmelite order and became a priest, and he moved to Chicago. And he was, in those days, priests and the nuns ran the high schools and the elementary schools. So he taught. He taught physics at a big Chicago high school in the 1930s.
Wow.
And he was a basketball coach. And now you can imagine the hype on basketball, even in that time, in those big Catholic, it was a Catholic school.
Yeah.
And so he not only taught physics at high school, science, but he was also a basketball coach. And then the Carmelite order moved him to Niagara Falls. So he was pastor at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Niagara Falls.
On the U.S. side?
No, on Niagara Falls, Ontario.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
There's a Carmelite order in Niagara Falls where he went, and of course then he became pastor. So he was a pastor, he was a priest. Well, my mother, going a little bit about her, she came from Ottawa. She was born in 1926. And Rose, she was a singer. So in those days, she sang on the radio. Beautiful voice.
Really?
Her father, my grandfather, was the conductor of the Ottawa Symphony Orchestra at the time. So music was in her blood. And she was a singer. She didn't play instruments, but beautiful voice on the radio. So she moved to Niagara Falls. She was a nurse at the Niagara Falls General Hospital. Well, she joined the choir at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And that's where they met.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that, wow. And so that's where they met. Okay.
Yeah, and he left the priesthood to marry my mother, and then we all came along, and that was the story.
Wow. And when he left the priesthood, what was his profession that he?
Teacher.
Okay, he went on to become a teacher.
Yeah, so he taught at what is now Holy Cross Secondary School in St. Catharines, but at the time it was Grantham High School. And so he taught for 20-some years at Grantham High School, and then again he taught physics mostly and some general science.
Wow, wow. And what do you do for a living? What's been your pursuit?
Well, I was a teacher for 17 years. I taught elementary school. I taught mostly grades 7 and 8, so middle school. And then I decided I wanted to get my PhD. My areas of teaching were mostly math, science, and physical education. So, you know, I taught that on Rotary, and I loved teaching those subjects. And it was great to have my students also on my teams because it was a way to keep control. When you're a grade 7 and 8 teacher, you got to deal with those boys sometimes. So, you know, you're their coach, you're the phys ed, you got a bit of a handle on it. And I loved it. So, but I wanted to go on and pursue further education. So I got my PhD in science education at the University of Buffalo. Wow. And at the time, they were hiring for a science education professor at Brock University in St. Catharines. So I was hired. And for the next 22 years, I taught at the university level in a teacher's education program at Brock University.
Wow.
And now I'm retired and enjoying life.
The purpose of this interview is to talk about a special place that was created by your parents. And I know you went on as a player to play in another special place, and we had Monty Slingerman taught, and he, again, you must be handing him $100 bills because he spoke so highly of you as a captain of that team. But it was another special place, and I think you must have carried over what your parents had done it with the Spartans to where you went, you know, and maybe in a way. But let's. Apparently, your dad was watching the movie about the last 300 Spartans.
Yes. Yes.
And who starred in that movie?
Yes, and I know it is. I can see his face. It was the 300 Spartans.
300 Spartans.
And
wasn't Charlton Heston?
No. Oh, I was going to look it up before I came in here because I knew I would be asked that question, and it'll come to me at some point. But yes, so what had happened at the time was I was starting to play lacrosse, and they needed a coach. So my dad said, well, he'd coach, but he'd never played lacrosse.
But basketball.
Yeah,
it's similar. Yeah.
And it was unbelievable what he did with his teams. But he started off just teaching basketball skills, the give and go, the pivots. You know, all of that was just ingrained in us from the beginning. But he was so successful as a coach, and we won an Ontario championship. In those days, it was A. It was always A. So we had won an Ontario championship. So he started coaching, and he was successful immediately.
Wow.
So he went to the organization, and it's St. Catharines A's, the St. Catharines Minor Lacrosse Association at the time. They wanted him to stay with his team. He wanted to stay with that level and continue to train because he was such a good developer of lacrosse talent. And he said, no, you know what, I've worked with these kids for a year now, and I want to go up to the next level with them. And they said, no, we want you to stay there. He said, no, I want to stay with these kids. So he said, well, if you're going to allow me to do that, I'm going to get my own lacrosse team. And so that was the genesis of the Spartans.
Oh, okay.
So he took them, and it was outlawed at first. Like, we had difficulty.
What year was that, roughly?
1963.
Okay.
So at the time, and coming back to your question about the 300 Spartans, he had no name for the organization yet. So we're watching this movie, and he said, wow.
They're organized and they're disciplined.
Oh my goodness. The persistence, the resilience, the courage.
Yeah.
So he said, we're going to call ourselves the Spartan Warriors, Spartan Athletic Association. So that's where it came from.
Wow. Yeah. And then, so it started with lacrosse, but this thing, you take your time and explain the lacrosse growing and then all the other things that started growing out of it. You know?
So, I mean, we had one team at the beginning. It was just a single team.
Yeah.
And he was successful with it. The mantra my parents had was, no child should ever be rejected from playing the game through financial difficulty. So there were a lot of kids who wanted to play, but they couldn't afford the equipment or the sticks or whatever. So we had been... There's a building in St. Catharines called the Queen Elizabeth Community Center. And at the time, my dad, before even the Spartans were born, he was coaching floor hockey. We played floor hockey out of there. But there's a lot of kids from that area. It was a lower income area at the time, that near the community center, that came in and played floor hockey, and we got to know each other. And so what my dad said was, what happened was they heard about this new organization, which was helping kids to play other sports.
Wow.
When lacrosse began. So he brought in a lot of those kids. Well, we started to grow and grow and grow, and there was 2 teams and now 4 teams, and there were 8 teams. Wow. And so it grew over the early part of the 60s to an organization that had many, many teams at all levels. And so, he was successful. He brought in really good, my mom and dad brought in really good people to coach. And they were very strict about how it had to work. So talking of my dad, my mom was the bulldog of the organization. She was the one that ran the day-to-day operation.
Yeah, and he's somebody.
And she was tough, but she was committed like nobody I've ever seen.
Wow.
And my dad was there. He was amazing, but she was the one that would go out and talk to people and get them interested in coaching. But we all knew, because I coached for her for 30 years. I coached in the Spartans for 30 years as I grew older. I started coaching when I was about 15. And her rules were that we were all to be in communication with each other. So the novice, peewee, bantam, midget coaches, we had a system where we had set it up so that we knew what we were to do in order to prepare the kids for the next levels. Coaches talked. She wanted fair, equitable play and coaching from all her coaches. She demanded excellence from them, and they gave it to her. Like, she was 5'0", but she was tough.
And seemed like she really knew what she was doing.
She did. She was a real leader, leader of men and women throughout the era that they were in the Spartans. And my dad, of course, he was always there. He did a lot of the legwork for the organization, and he was an amazing coach, and he was also the president of the organization. But in the background, she was integral to the success of the Spartans through her ability to commandeer people to come in and work in the most highly organized and ethical and supportive way that was possible. So there are amazing people who brought in, and eventually the word got out and everybody wanted to play for the Spartans. So we had the lacrosse, and then we moved into hockey. But earlier on, in the early years, I played basketball, soccer, baseball, all through the Spartans. They would put in teams. Probably in the 70s, it focused mostly on hockey and lacrosse. But before that, in the 60s, there were multiple sports that we played through the Spartans.
Now you said a lot of kids had their freight paid for them. Yeah. And how did they fundraise to take care of that situation?
So that was my dad.
And he
so here he is. He was a teacher, so he would go in and teach. And I remember him coming home. He'd have something to eat, and off he'd go. And he'd be out soliciting funds from big corporations, from businesses, from sports organizations, sports athletic facilities in St. Catharines. He would go out and do that. In the evening, he'd be coaching. Sometimes all weekends he was busy. So he never stopped. And I can remember him coming in. I mean, I was part of that, so I would come in with him. But here we're coming in at 10 or 11 o'clock at night after maybe an away game. And he's at his desk preparing for the next day, marking till 1 or 2 in the morning. And this was a consistent thing with him. He labored so selflessly for the kids and for the organization throughout his life. And I think he brought that with him. I, of course, don't know how he was in Chicago, but I heard about him because he also coached basketball in Niagara Falls as the pastor of St. Patrick's. He started a basketball league. And I talked to other people who knew him at that era, and they said he was an amazing coach, but his leadership and his emotional care for all the kids was legendary.
Wow, wow, wow. And you were blessed to be their son.
Oh, well, there's no, I mean, I've done a few things in lacrosse and hockey, I've coached in that, but nobody can replace that. Nobody can live up. None of my brothers or my sister, none of us could ever have lived up.
So how many kids were in the family?
So I'm the oldest.
Okay.
And then there's one younger brother who's Earl, and 2 twin brothers, Tim and Tom, and my sister Rosemary.
All right.
So the 5 of us. So all of us played hockey and lacrosse throughout. My My sister, she was one of the biggest cheerleaders for the whole organization. Not physically cheerleading, but went along to the games, was always there in support of us. And so we were a lacrosse and hockey family, but mostly lacrosse.
It sounds with a club like that, did you actually have a home field or a home, like where, a clubhouse?
No.
Or
No, in fact, we lived in Niagara-on-the-Lake, again, as I mentioned earlier, right, until I was married. It was 370 Gate Street in Niagara-on-the-Lake. That was the headquarters. There was no clubhouse, but everything was farmed out. Everything was done at the arena level or the field level in St. Catharines. All of the people that were coaches or on the executive for the Spartans were all living in St. Catharines. So we'd meet at their houses. My parents would meet them, we'd have meetings there, or come to Niagara-on-the-Lake for meetings. Yeah. But no, there was no clubhouse. But I should mention something about my parents that is rather unique again. It's a carryover from their philanthropy in terms of sports. When I mentioned earlier that we had a number of young men, boys at the time, who were from less than ideal situations.
Yeah.
And we lived in Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Yep.
So there were lots of farms. And in those days, kids didn't mind going out and picking fruit.
Okay.
So my parents would have 12 to 15 boys living at this house in Niagara-on-the-Lake throughout the summer picking fruit. And my mom would have them out. We'd be out at the farm at 8 o'clock in the morning, working all day. Then we have sports at night. But these kids would go out. We'd all drive our bikes to the farms and we'd pick fruit all day. And we go and we play lacrosse at night. It was an amazing place. I mean, I grew up with another dozen brothers, but they would get funds to help support for the food and everything. And I can remember all the kids, we'd march off to church, the boys would be marched off to church on a Sunday morning, whether they were Catholic or not, and they all went, because Rose would not hear anything other than, yes, you're getting up and you're going to church. But I can remember her sitting there at night making big bags of sandwiches for all the kids, and she'd make them and she'd bring them out at lunch, and big jugs of Kool-Aid. But we were all there on the farms working, and these kids made some money for themselves. So they kept everything that they made. They'd have some money now to take care of themselves. But my parents never asked a cent from any of them. And my dad would go out and get funds, food for the kids. Dozens of eggs would be donated, and so that was the place. That's the Spartan household. That's where it really
this
started.
Seems like a movie.
Yeah.
Or it should be made.
It should. The story of my parents, I mean, the fact that he left the priesthood to marry her, to form this major organization in St. Catharines, is a story in of itself. But their lives, for the 50 years that they ran this organization, it is astounding. It's story worthy.
50 years they ran it. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
So talk about, like, it reached an apex at some point. What was the apex in your mind where it hit the highest point?
I would say the apex was all through the 70s and 80s.
Really?
And there were over 2,000 kids in both lacrosse and hockey at the time. The hockey organization was huge, all the way from little ones skating right up to intermediate, juvenile. I coached at the juvenile level, so they had 1,200 kids playing hockey.
Really?
Lacrosse, they had 2 or 3 teams at every level throughout the 70s and 80s.
Wow.
But what was happening was my parents were getting older. And in the 80s, my father...
energy level.
They couldn't do it anymore. Yeah. My dad had lost a leg in a car accident.
Really?
Yeah, so he was unable to really move around much.
And it makes it difficult when you're dealing with sport and everything else,
Yeah, and of course, we were all married at the time, raising our own families.
Yeah.
And so we didn't have the time to really step in to where they did, nor did we have the drive. They were exceptional people.
Right. It was,
and people don't normally do that. Like, they devoted their lives. My mom never worked after she was married, because she was a nurse before that, but she never worked. Her life was her family and the Spartans.
Wow.
And my dad, of course, worked, but you know, again, he would spend his evenings on that doing this. Who can do that?
Did your mom keep singing through all this?
No, she didn't. She gave everything up to do what she did, to raise her family and to run the Spartans.
Wow.
And yeah, she loved it. She loved it. And you could see it. I mean, we had numerous tournaments that she would run for the Spartans, but the intermediate, so the Fred Conradi tournament. And if you know Fred Conradi, legendary St. Catharines player and coach.
Yeah.
She loved Fred Conradi. In fact, I played for Peter in junior before I played for Monty.
Right.
But Fred she loved him. She just thought the world of him. So when he passed, she started a lacrosse tournament at the intermediate level, Fred Conradi Memorial Tournament. And I can remember all these tournaments that she would run. She'd come in with a big smile. Oh, this is my weekend. Here we go again. And we'd all be working there. We would be running the clocks or taking care of the arenas, registering teams. All the brothers and my sister and everybody was there. Eventually my daughter, she would be timekeeping. My boys would be playing, but she was in her element. So it was a labor of love for her. And my father too. But, you know, it was just so good to see her the way she was when she got out. And even in the arena, like I coached with her. She was my manager when I was coaching for a number of years. And, you know, whenever it was a problem, it would be my mom that would go in and say, boys, that's enough. Because nobody ever argued with Rose.
They didn't have any ground to stand on.
Oh, no, she was always right.
Yeah.
So it was in the 70s and 80s, but they became really too old. My father still did all the work on the phone, and my mother did all the groundwork.
And what ages were they at that, where you start to get...
Yeah, my dad would have been about 75, 76 at the time.
Oh, my Lord, really?
And when he lost his leg, so he couldn't really get out anymore. And of course, my brothers and I, we helped my mom a lot.
Yeah.
We all coached. We all went and did fundraising because they had bingos or euchre tournaments, raise money for the Spartans, chocolate drives, ticket sales, and all these other things that we'd run. We'd help her. But, you know, we had our own lives too, and we were playing, we were coaching, I was coaching, I was working. And, you know, so my wife, she came in with me and she was a trainer on the teams I coached. Well, we were a lacrosse family too. My boys loved the game, but my daughter too. She loved to play. She played house league for me, but we just couldn't do it. So as they got older, and my mom was, you know, in her early 70s at the time, they sort of couldn't run the organization the way it needed to be run. And so gradually teams, we started to phase out some teams. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s.
Now, I saw Chris Spire's name was mentioned. Mm-hmm. When did he, like, tell us a little bit about that, because that seems like it was important.
It was. Yeah. And in fact, its importance, besides the fact that Chris did a great job, is that it was the last standing team that had the Spartan name.
Okay.
Because by then, the hockey had been taken away from us for reasons that were more political than anything. And so there was just a lacrosse. And as we lost teams, and St. Catharines would absorb them, which was great.
Yeah.
We had still the Junior Bs. And in 1979, the Niagara Junior B Warriors at the time folded. And so the Spartans wanted a Junior B team. So they took it over, and it was Chris Spires that came in and ran it. And Chris was amazing.
And how did you know Chris?
Chris played in the Spartan organization. Yes.
Okay, so he knew what the Spartan way was and that kind of
Absolutely.
thing. Yeah.
He was a Spartan through and through. His boys played Spartan. In fact, Chris was a general manager, and he was coach at certain times. But my brother Tom, he coached the Warriors during the time that Chris, some of the time that Chris was there. But Chris came in, and Chris really took it over. Right. And ran it for my mom and dad at the time. And he did an amazing job throughout the years.
He won some Founders Cups, right?
Yes, he did. Right. Yes, indeed. So, I mean, Chris was a dedicated Spartan, and he kept it going. And, of course, he did until 2 years ago. And, of course, I remember St. Catharines Paul Coates from St. Catharines coming to me, and Dan Pilon talking to me about where's that Spartan Junior B team going to go? And I said, since I was the senior Spartan left, I said it's going to the St. Catharines Junior A's, so that the St. Catharines A's will now take over the Spartans. Because for me, it was about keeping continuity from Junior B and Junior A. And that was one of the problems we had a little bit at the time. There wasn't always a strong relationship between the A's and the B's at the time. At sometimes, and it was both sides that were at fault.
Yeah.
But the Junior A's took over the Junior B team
Yeah.
last year, and they had a really successful year as a new. But what's interesting is when the handover came, they asked me, "What do you want? Do you want?" Because Spartans were always red and white. And we were always vying against the double blue of the athletics. So what do you want? Do you want the Junior Bs to stay red and white? And I said no. Because I think the St. Catharines organization is double blue, right? From paperweight through to Junior A, and they need to stay that way. But let's keep something to remind us of where that team came. So we talked about the uniforms. Spartans were red and white, but they had the lines up their sleeves, all the way up the sleeves that were red and white, alternating.
Okay.
So the Junior Bs decided, the St. Catharines Junior Bs decided to keep that. So now their uniforms have the blue and white all the way up the sleeves.
But the same kind
different.
of...
The same kind, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And it's amazing uniform. And they also have the Spartan emblem on their helmets. So that's how we remember that the Spartans were the first team with the Junior B in St. Catharines at that time.
Yeah. And if I can ask, just for pure historical purpose, when did your parents pass on, I guess, over the year, you know?
Yeah, my father passed in 2002.
Okay.
And my mother in 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, the fact that they're remembered in the Ontario Lacrosse Hall of Fame and the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame as St. Catharines Sports People of the Year is synonymous with the great work they did throughout the years. It to me is the legacy that should be maintained and remembered about them for all time. And this opportunity to talk about them, Jim, has been wonderful. You know, I love them, we all love them, we all respected them, and the fact that what they did will be remembered through this particular project is terrific.
Well, you think of all the kids who might not have had a chance to have some discipline in a positive way brought to them, and you think of how many stories changed because of that program, you know, from bad to good. You know,
I've talked to many of those men now.
Yeah.
In fact, I met somebody. I knew him well, but I met him this summer, and we were sitting talking, and he said he's retired now.
Yeah.
He was a bus driver in St. Catharines, worked for many years there, and he was on the road to jail at the time.
Yeah.
He said they turned my life around.
Wow.
And he's wonderful family. His wife, his boy played Junior B hockey here. Great hockey player, great lacrosse player. Wonderful family. And he said, this is a result of what your parents offered me when I needed it most.
Wow.
There's many stories like that.
Doesn't get any.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll just say this again, Monty Slingerman talks about you and what you meant to that amazing moment they had with the 73 team that won the Junior B, you know, everything that year. They won everything.
Yep.
It upsets right and left, and you had amazing teammates. You know, like that team.
Mike French and Willie Plett.
Yeah. Oh God. Like,
Normie Hope.
Yeah.
You know, Johnny Weens. These just amazing. And John Scooble, our goalie. Amazing. It was. You know, I played junior hockey, junior lacrosse. Played many different sports. I played university hockey, and we've had success or not, but I can never remember a team that cohered as well as that. It was the amazing team, as you mentioned. I was captain, but I had Normie Hope and Mike French as my assistant captains, and the three of us would get together with Monty. We talk stuff, strategies, and everything. But the team was a team, a real team, and it's our 50th anniversary coming up in 2023,
Yeah.
this year. And so I think we'll probably get together with the Junior B Warriors that we had. Most of the guys we've got Mike French in Philadelphia, we've got Willie Platt in Atlanta, but they all came up for our 40th,
Yeah.
which was a few years ago, obviously, in 2013, where we were honored by the St. Catharines Old Boys Lacrosse Association. We had 80% of the guys that were still alive there. I expect we'll get the same number coming in June of this year to celebrate our 50th anniversary of that great win in British Columbia.
Okay. Great.